All right, so I believe that is all set. It's extremely complicated because not only do I have to turn off my regular keyboard before I put the URLs up on the other sites, but then I have to do it uphill too onto my laptop, which is propped up at a weird angle. Anyway, you don't care. I don't care. Nobody cares. Happy holidays. Happy couple of days after Christmas for those who do Christmas, and any other holiday you happen to celebrate. Holidays are good. That's as far as I'm concerned. Holidays are good things. They're an excuse for goodness. They're an excuse for getting together when there isn't a pandemic going on. They're an excuse for food. They're an excuse for kindness and even for gift giving, which I actually rather think is a good thing. I will start off by telling you quickly that we had a very nice Christmas, which is what we celebrate, although I must admit fairly non-religiously. But we had a very nice Christmas. I had a sort of dicey Christmas Eve, which I already talked about on the broadcast at 2 a.m. And I will encapsulate quickly for those of you who weren't here, which was that I got bitten as I was just starting to wrap presents Christmas Eve. I got bitten twice by a tick, the same damn tick. Got it off me. You know, I'm not unused to it. We have dogs. We live in the hills. You know, we're surrounded by vegetation, so not a big deal. I just cleaned it up and sprayed some antibacterial stuff on it, et cetera, et cetera. It was a dog tick, so I'm not too worried about those as a general rule because they're not the ones that carry Lyme disease. So then within the next maybe 20 minutes or less after that happened, I started to feel really weird. And so I went upstairs to just kind of cool out for a little while. And one after another, all these symptoms of allergic reaction kind of hit me. And it was like horrible itching all over and really hot, extremely hot, like in the midst of as bad a fever as you can ever remember getting. And what else? Oh yeah, my face broke out. There's still a little bit of redness in a couple of places here. Skin broke out, and then my lips started to swell. And about this point, I was getting a little worried. So I went to my kids, the two kids who were up and out in the living room, and said, "By the way, do me a favor, come in and check on me every now and then. I'm not going to be able to do anything else. I'm just going to bed because I feel so weird, and I am so itchy, and I am scratching all over." And they wanted to know, should I go to the emergency room? But I basically felt like Christmas Eve at the emergency room in the middle of a pandemic, I'd be taking away from people who needed the help more than I did. And by that point, it kind of felt like it had plateaued, and I'd taken an antihistamine. And indeed, over the next couple of hours, the symptoms gradually subsided, although I was wiped out and I had to get up early Christmas morning to do the stuff I was going to do. So I've never had an allergic reaction to anything before. I've never had allergies as far as I know, but apparently I do to the saliva of certain ticks. So I'm going to use this public forum as a way to say, you ticks with toxic saliva, just keep the hell away from me, all right? Please, in the future, We'll respect each other's boundaries, and just don't come near me, because that was a really disturbing experience, when your mouth's swelling and you're so hot you feel like you're on fire and everything itches. Oh, and everything does itch. It starts in your joints, I mean, the places where your skin comes together, like your underarms and your neck and jaw and stuff, and then it just spreads. And it's very fortunate for me, I had just trimmed my nails for no particular reason. I didn't know I was going to need to do that. But luckily for me, I did, because my nails grow really fast, and I would have literally scratched myself to blood if I hadn't done that. Because there's when that happens, there's nothing else you can do but scratch. It's like battle stations, all alert, and you're just going like, God, what is this? Anyway, it passed. We had a very nice Christmas. I did eventually get everything done. And we're here. So I'm not going to dwell on it. It's not a big deal. Many other people have gone through worse things. I just thought it was the first time I've ever had an allergic reaction, and it was on Christmas Eve. So I thought it was kind of interesting, and I thought I would share it because of that. Anyway, so let me just quickly see who has dropped by to visit me tonight. Jared. Hello, Jared. James. Yo, dude. Wouter. Hello. Good to see you as always. Kelly. And Jerry, hey Jerry, and Barban and Angie and Alexis, hello, what's up with you? Emily, hello. Ronnie, back again, yeah man, I'm impressed. Kenneth, hi Mike, hi James, that chair looks lonely. Oh, the chair in the background, I think that's Deb's chair. She didn't make it down today, so it's just wherever she last left it. Jeremy, guten Abend, and to you too. Tim, hello. Hi, Nancy. Yes, I'm doing much better, tick bite-wise. Mahmoud, I am good. Good morning to you, too. Carl, hello, Carl. And Amy and Sally and Becca. All my favorite people are here. Chris. And did I get everybody? Let's see if anybody else snuck in here since then. Nope, looks like we got it. Angie, thank you. That's good advice about an EpiPen. We should have an EpiPen around at all times anyway, because one of our young people is actually is very susceptible to allergies, all kinds of allergies, and shellfish and things like that. As I said, the weird thing is I've never had that reaction before. Lynn, hi Lynn. Is that yours just says Oz, A-U-S, but that could be Austria, or that could be Australia, or it could be Austin. So I'm not sure which, but it doesn't matter. I like all those places. And come to think of it, I've been to all of them. So very welcome. Lovely to see you. So anyway, what else? So we had our Christmas. It was a nice Christmas. It was, of course, a very locked-down Christmas. My brother, who lives across town, couldn't go see him and his family. My parents, who lived just the other side of the hill, couldn't go see them, although they seemed to be doing well. And my other brother, who's also on the other side of the hill, seems to be doing well also, his family, who are all very dear to us, and their children obviously are our nephews and very important to us. And lots of people and friends we would have loved to see over Christmas, but of course that ain't happening. So here we are, and I'm sure many of you are in the same situation, or maybe even worse. We certainly do not lack for company here. There are times when Deborah and I, we occasionally kind of think, yeah, it would be really interesting to have an empty nest, and how would that work, and things like that. But we also love our young people very much, and they're a good bunch of people. Even if they weren't ours, they're a good bunch of people. So no complaints. Anyway, so that's what's going on for me, and happy to be here, happy to be relatively compos mentis at least, and mens in corpore sano, I guess. Sound mind and a sound body, although there are some questions about the mind long before any tick got its jaws into me. But anyway, so we are here. I am going to continue reading The War of the Flowers. What we read last night, for those of you who were not here, was basically Theo and Applecore left Applecore's shared, well, it's an apartment in our terms. It's a comb if you are a sprite, because it's a little tiny housing project made for very small people. So Applecore and her roommates live there, but Applecore is still helping Theo to find his way around. So she led him to Jonquil House, which is a line is part. They're part of the Daisy clan, which is where Theo started in Fairyland, and she didn't want to go see anybody that Tansy had sent them to because she didn't really trust any of them. And after Theo kind of hanging around with Poppy Thornapple, whose father is one of the arch villains as far as Theo is concerned, mens sana in corpore sano. Thank you, Amy. I knew I forgot a word in there. So I just said a mind and a sound body, which may actually be closer to the truth. Just the mind, but the body works. Anyway, so they wound up at the Daffodil Compound. The Daffodil Compound. I can't remember now. It'll be mentioned in the book again, I think. And Theo was extensively tested by Lady Jonquil, who has a kind of a scientific interest in mortals in particular and doesn't get much chance to explore these things. So that's where they were, and Theo met Cumber Sedge, who is a fairisher, which is another one of the kind of quote-unquote lower-class fairies, who is working as a lab assistant for Lady Amelia. And they've gone out afterwards for dinner, and Cumber is telling them a little bit about his life and etc. And in the middle of it, Lady Amelia's son, Xyrus, has arrived at this restaurant place and is extremely drunk and very friendly, and he wants to take them out to a club. So I'm going to start back again another paragraph or two just to give you guys a running start on before I hand the baton on to tonight's reading. So we're just having dinner, Cumber began. No, you're coming with us. It's a holiday, isn't it? Bring your friend. Xyrus squinted blearily just a bit to the side of Theo's face, and for a moment Theo thought the Fairy Lord was going to be sick. Why, who's that? Who's that? There's someone on your shoulder, Daisy. Her name is Applecore. I'm a friend of your mother's, the sprite said a bit sternly. Ooh, Xyrus grinned. Then you'd better come along. Then you'd better come along too, so she doesn't find out where we're going until it's all over. Go where? The most wonderful club. Very new. Everyone's talking. And they will be until it closes in a week or so, and they're talking about something else. Xyrus chortled. Come along. I insist. Haven't seen old Cumberbumber here for a shock dog's age. He grabbed Theo by the arm. He had his mother's grip, and Theo found himself pulled up onto his feet. I insist. We'll go in my coach. The rest of this lot can find their own way. He tugged Theo toward the front of the restaurant, with Applecore buzzing along beside their heads, and Cumber Sedge hurrying along after. Don't we have to pay for our dinners? Theo asked as they reached the door. Pay? Rubbish! Why, Needle? Put it on my bill. The bent old fairy behind the counter didn't look pleased, but didn't say anything as they banged out the door and into the cold evening air. He's probably a bit miffed because I haven't settled my tab in a few months, Xyrus confided to Theo as he hurried them down a winding path toward the compound's front gate. Mother's being dreadfully stingy about advances on my allowance. Hoy! I'll go wake up that lazy driver of mine. I can see him sleeping from here. As Xyrus skipped off toward a long limousine that was idling in a little parking lot just beside the gate, Theo slowed down until Cumber Sedge caught up with him. Do we have to do this? Cumber shrugged, embarrassed. It's not a good idea to say no to Xyrus. He's like his mother. He's curious about things. He'll just get even more interested in you and start asking questions, and not necessarily only around Daffodil House. I'm lucky most of the time he forgets I exist. Come on, you lot, Xyrus shouted. I don't like it, said Applecore quietly in Theo's ear. But at least we're not likely to get picked up by the constables while we're out with him. Nobody arrests a flower. It's not being arrested I'm worrying about, whispered Theo, remembering Rufinus Weft Daisy slumped back slumped on the train station bench. But Cyrus Jonquil was trotting back toward them in a not entirely straight line, waving his arms and urging them to hurry. Sorry, sorry, this is all my fault, said some Cumbersedge. By the way, Theo asked Applecore, I understand the Daisy part. That's how she introduced him, as Theodorus Weft Daisy. I understand the Daisy part, but why do you keep telling people my name is Weft Daisy? What does Weft mean? Bastard, she said. Don't look at me like that, you thick. I'm just telling you what the word means. Cyrus Jonquil kept talking as they rode across town, a drunken but also highly entertaining recitation about silly people and unusual events that Theo felt sure he would find even more amusing if he knew any of the subjects or even a bit more about the world in which they all lived. A lot of the stories seemed to be about people getting into trouble in places they shouldn't be, off their own turf. To hear Cyrus tell it, these shenanigans sounded a bit like the early parts of West Side Story, funny and more exciting than dangerous. But as Theo looked out the car window at some of the bleak, run-down neighborhoods they were now crossing, he thought the area itself looked like some of the less charming parts of Los Angeles, more like Bloods and Crips than Sharks and Jets. Where are we going exactly? He asked Cumber. This club? I'm not certain, said the researcher, but it does seem a bit far. I think we're already at the far end of the Eventide district. Cyrus, where are we going? Just into moonlight. Their host's tone was light, but Theo could tell by the uneasy look on Cumber's face that it was not such a minor thing. This isn't good, Theo, Applecore whispered in his ear. Ask him what the name of the club is. When Theo did, Cyrus smiled and drained another glass of something he had poured himself from the bar built into the car door. Oh, you probably haven't heard of it. It's only been open a couple of weeks. It's called Christmas, and it's quite good. He laughed as Cumbersedge flinched. You really have to get out more, Cumberbumber. If the name of the place bothers you, wait until you see the decor. Where exactly is this place, Cyrus? Cumber asked. I didn't think there were any clubs in Moonlight, just house towers and government buildings and places like that. Ah, but that's what makes this club so good, the young Jonquil Lord said. It's in the basement of Hellebore House. A 6-inch tall sprite had to gulp loudly to be heard so clearly. Theo's uneasy feeling suddenly grew a great deal more intense. Not good, he whispered. Very not good, she whispered back. Oh, stop it, you two, said Cyrus. Everybody makes such a massive fuss about the Hellebores, just because the father's awful and political and the heir is a bit of a strange weed. But some of the younger ones are quite fun in a wild sort of way. Besides, how else would any of us from Daffodil ever get to see the inside of Hellebore House? But I don't want to see the inside of Hellebore House. Cumber had clearly had more to drink than he usually did, and had become ever more silent and morose during the journey. There are enemies. Enemies? Cyrus shook his head in amused astonishment. Do you believe all that nonsense about a flower war? It will never happen. Bark and root, they're always squabbling in Parliament. The goblins will rise up and execute us all before the houses go to war with each other. Speaking of, this part of Eventide really has gone to seed, hasn't it? He frowned. Outside the window, the streets were crowded again, but it did not seem like a happy scene. Most of the folk on the sidewalk were goblins, and what looked to Theo's untutored eye like various kinds of doonies and squat boggarts and other not quite human-looking folk. They seemed listless and unfocused, standing or even sitting on the sidewalk in the harsh, silvery light of the street lamps, collected in little knots. Many of them looked sullenly at the car as it slid past them. Theo remembered something from his great-uncle's book about the shape of the city being a sort of spiral. So Daffodil House is in Gloaming, right? he asked Applecore. And this is what, eventide? And we're going to moonlight? So does it just keep going? I mean, does it get darker and darker? Is there a middle of the night or something? Let's not talk about it, she said. Why? Because. No whispering, you too, said Cyrus. Blast, we're out of brandy. He settled back in the seat and crossed his legs. What brings you to the city, Daisy? He came with me, Applecore said quickly. He'd never been, and he wanted to do some sightseeing. Sightseeing, Cyrus groaned. Don't let her drag you round to all that nonsense. Winter Dynasty Bridge, Knocker's Walk, all that. Stick with me. I'll show you the real city. That's very kind of you. Theo was wondering how quickly they would be able to shed this young jonquil lord and get back to Daffodil House. He did not like the idea of being introduced around. What if they ran into someone who really was from Daisy Town, or whatever the damn place had been called? He could only pray that this would be one of those clubs where the music was so loud you couldn't do anything but nod and smile while people yelled unintelligible questions. Speaking of the real city, said Cyrus, we're just coming into 7 Bloom Square. You know all of the old stories from the last war with the giants, I'm sure. Sweet Pea's charge, the Battle of the Twilight Bell, all that. Theo knew nothing of the sort, but nodded and tried to look intelligent. Well, it's rubbish. At least about the 7 blooms, and I should know, because we daffodils were one of them. Well, it's not all rubbish. But the bit about people all cheering when the 7 families announced they were going to create a new parliament, that certainly is. It was all done in secret, and only because they were all tired out from trying to kill each other after the giants were defeated. Nobody was cheering, because the king and queen were dead, and everyone was terrified. My great-uncle swears on all the trees that old Otho Primrose was so frightened and shaking so badly that he couldn't have signed the treaty except Lord Violet was helping to hold up his arm. Theo had no idea what any of it meant, although there were a few faint resonances with things he had read in his own great-uncle's book. He was having trouble thinking clearly and wished he hadn't had the wine. A light spatter of rain on the coach windows broke the strange, witchy lights of the city center up into a smear of silver and green and blue spots, but it seemed to be getting darker outside rather than brighter, as though they were leaving the well-lit areas behind. In the middle of a long patch of blackness, broken only by an occasional street lamp, the coach slowed and stopped. What's going on? Cumbersedge didn't seem nervous, just confused, but then he probably didn't have as much to worry about as Theo did. Checkpoint, explained Cyrus. Theo could vaguely make out a dark shape blocking the way, some kind of wall. Low voices spoke for a moment, their own driver no more intelligible than the guards or whatever they were. Then the coach again moved forward, but more slowly this time. There it is, said Cyrus. Hellebore House. Mad bastards, a lot of them, but you have to admit the old place has style. Theo couldn't make out much of anything until the young daffodil lord flicked his fingers at the door and the window slid silently down, letting in a spatter of misty rain. After Theo blinked the water out of his eyes, he saw the huge, pale spike. It was so strange an object that it took him a moment to get the perspective. If it had looked more like an office building or a castle tower, it would have happened immediately, but it looked like nothing so much as a kind of ivory chess piece out of some abstract set, a very slender rook or a predatory queen. It was not cylindrical, like the daffodil towers, but four-sided, as far as Theo could tell, although neither of its visible sides were rectangles. Not quite, although they looked like they might have started out that way. The whole structure seemed to have been stretched out of true, as though a great hand had reached down, grabbed the tower by its spiky, many-gabled roof, an odd contrast with the simplicity of the rest of the building's lines, and yanked on it. pulling it up into the dark sky like a piece of bone-colored taffy. It was lit by carefully arranged spotlights, some with a reddish tint, and all its windows were black. It looked like the shell of an alien animal, or a skull with hundreds of eye sockets. I don't like that place. There was more to Theo's aversion than he could express, an alien coldness that came down on him suddenly and with great weight. It reminded him queasily of something, a nightmare? But he could not remember what it was. He only knew that he was having trouble getting his breath and that he wished he were somewhere else. "Why should you like it?" Applecore asked. "They're not nice people in there?" Cumber Sedge only mumbled as he stared out the window. The Farisher, Theo realized, was pretty seriously drunk. "Wait until you see the club," said Zyrus, pouring himself another drink. "It's really interesting." Theo had now heard the word interesting several times from Lady Amelia and her son. He was beginning to suspect that it had two meanings for them, and neither of those matched the definition of the word as he had previously known it. One was horrible. The other was especially horrible for mortals. "I don't think I want to see any more interesting things," he announced, but it was far, far too late. They were already in the driveway that led to the main gate. He felt as though something was waiting for him, something dreadful. He hoped it was only that he wasn't used to fairy liquor. At first it seemed like it was going to be even worse than he had thought. The hulking ogres at the massive gate shining lights into the car, the long wait which Theo was convinced would end with them all being dragged out and handcuffed or put into stocks, or whatever restraints they used on wanted criminals in fairyland. Applecore had moved to his shoulder. He could feel her sitting there, a tensed, hard little object that seemed made of springs and knobs. He realized he had never seen their driver and had a sudden suspicion that the creature behind the wheel was one of the corpse-like hollow men, that this whole episode had been an elaborate trap. But instead, the ogres stepped back, and the limousine suddenly rolled forward again, through a renewed flurry of rain that slapped against the windshield, then down a dark and disturbingly long tunnel that dumped them into an underground parking lot about 5 seconds before Theo's paranoia hit the critical point. In a daze, he followed Cumber Sedge, who didn't seem any more eager to go than he was. Zyrus Jonquil almost had to push them both out of the car. As they walked across the echoing, silver-lit garage, Theo looked back at the limousine, but could not make out the driver's face through the darkened windows. They could already feel the music as they waited for the elevator, a thumping, jarring sensation as though something extremely large was trying to escape from the floor below them. A few more fairy lordlings joined them, laughing and talking so fast and in such emphatic slang that Theo couldn't understand a word. He let himself be moved into the elevator like a puppet. When the door opened, the sound hit him like an explosion, a walloping bass and strange polyrhythms he couldn't quite wrap his head around, topped with a soaring wind instrument like a clarinet. Two huge gray hands patted him down in a rough but cursory fashion, then shoved him through into the noise and the flashing lights and the crowds of extravagantly dressed, although some were nearly naked, and almost uniformly gorgeous young fairies. Transparent shapes gyrated in midair among the dancers, shapes that looked like nothing so much as ghosts and which popped like soap bubbles when the dancers touched them. But nothing stunned him as much as realizing what the club actually was. A church? He had been expecting something more in keeping with the name, some kind of mock horror decadence with a Yuletide theme. Serial killer Santa, maybe, mutilated elves, black tinsel, and scorched trees. Instead, he could have been in the chapel, albeit a large one, of an Episcopalian church. There were stained glass windows lit from behind, and a simple altar near the far wall beneath a large crucifix from which even the most frenetic of the dancing fairies, in their extravagant finery, seemed to keep a respectful distance. The Jesus on the cross was not even one of the more tormented, bloody sorts that Theo had marveled at in Mexican churches during his traveling days. He was about to say something about it to Cumber Sedge, bellow something, since that was all that could be done, but the Farrisher stumbled against him and almost fell. This is horrible, Cumber groaned. We have to get him out of here, Applecore shouted in Theo's ear. Is he drunk? It's that. She pointed a tiny hand at the crucifix. These people, they're all crazy, sick. And suddenly he remembered what she had told him about swearing, and realized that it was the Christian symbols themselves which gave this place its nasty cachet. They didn't need to have pictures of mangled children or evil toys. It wasn't the Christmas bit that was the draw here for Fairy's jaded gentry. It was the Christ bit. Not modern Christmas, but Christ Mass. Where are you going? Cyrus shouted. He had already found a drink somewhere. This is fabulous, isn't it? They've actually hired Bishop Silver to do the music. All those great old music charms. Everyone wants to get him. He's absolutely the most vaporous tunesmith in the city. Makes his own phantasms, too, you know. Theo waved his hand in a distracted way. He guessed that the phantasms must be the transparent, faintly glowing figures flying around the dance floor. The music certainly was interesting. He could hear all kinds of strange, fragmentary resonances, and could sense noises in it that he couldn't quite catch with his ears. He would have loved to learn more about it, but not here, not now. Yeah, it's great, Theo roared back above the din. Can I get you something? Cumber's not feeling very well. Theo struggled to keep the Farrisher upright. He'd been in this position before, but it was the first time he'd ever had to carry someone out of a club because of too much Jesus. Is there another room? Cyrus laughed. You're doing okay, though, country boy. A bit more than you seem, eh? Right, I think there's a quiet room just up the stairs. I'll catch up with you. I've just seen some friends. The room was open to the dance floor, and the noise boiling up from below didn't make it a whole lot easier to talk, but at least they couldn't see the crucifix from the table in the dark room. Theo got Cumber sitting upright, and Applecore fanned his face with her wings until he seemed a bit more himself. Sorry, he mumbled, just not my sort of thing. That's okay, Theo said. Do you want some water? No. Another drink? Are you sure? The Farrisher nodded his head grimly. It'll make it easier. We'll be here a while. Well, why don't we just go home by ourselves? Catch a cab or something. And how are we going to pay for it, boyo? Asked Applecore. Do you have any tallies? No, I didn't think so. Cumber? The Farrisher shook his head. I'd pay for the meal in the restaurant. I left it on the table. It's one thing for Cyrus to walk out on bill, but I'm not the jonquil heir. He sighed. But that was all I had, so we'll have to wait for him to take us home. Could I have that drink? I'll be perfectly happy to put that on Cyrus's tab. I'll go find a waitress, said Applecore, and hummed straight over the railing into the seething mass of creatures below. Another group of fairies, apparently upper crust and dressed in a weird mixture of what looked to Theo like high Victorian and slashed and smeared punky goth fashions, piled into the quiet room and settled around a table in the opposite corner, making it much less quiet. Theo frowned and moved a bit closer to Cumber Sedge. I don't know how much you know about me, Theo said, but I really don't want anyone to, notice me. There were people trying to kill us on our way to Daffodil House. I shouldn't even be here. Nor should I, said Cumber mournfully. Don't belong. I'm just saying that I don't know enough to pass myself off as anything really. So please help me out. We can't afford to draw any attention. We just need to stay sort of quiet and unnoticed until your jonquil friend takes us home again." Understood. Cumber tried to lay his finger alongside his nose in a gesture of secret solidarity and managed to poke himself in the eye. Applecore buzzed back in, followed a few moments later by a waitress who took one look at Theo and Cumber Sedge and went to take orders at the other table first. "How are you boys?" Applecore asked. "Enjoying this charming place?" "I was just telling Cumber that we need to be inconspicuous." "No worries about that," the Ferrisher said. Nobody here wants to see you. These flower folk, they could care less. One of the lesser classes, even worse, one of the other races." He shook his head. "Wouldn't help you if you were lying dead in the street." The waitress appeared, an attractive fairy woman with surprisingly prominent wings. She was wearing an odd costume that Theo only figured out after she had left. Bearing their drinks order and instructed to charge it to the young lord of Jonquil House, it was a nun's habit, shortened and slit into a mini dress. "But Zyrus seems like an okay guy." "Oh, as far as they go, he's a good one." Cumber had recovered from his initial shock, but had become morose and distant. "But most of them wouldn't piss on you if you were on fire." "Unless you're lying on an expensive carpet," said Applecore. "So, are you telling me that no matter what language I spoke back in my world, I'd be speaking fairy here?" "You'd be speaking a common breath," Cumber said, working very hard to enunciate his consonants above the musical din. He'd had 3 drinks on Zyrus's tab, and what he had gained in cheerfulness he had lost in articulation. "That's the language all the races of Sherry fair. Bugger. Fairy share." Applecore, who had downed a few thimblefuls herself, giggled. She had left Theo's shoulder and was sitting in the middle of the table. "Okay, I guess I get that. But what if my normal language was, I don't know, Arabic? No, Chinese? Isn't it kind of weird that I'd arrive here and I'd see all you fairy folk from, like, old Irish stories and whatnot?" "That is an interesting question," said Cumber, downing the last of his drink. "You see, we don't see ourselves the way you do, and we don't see you the way you see you, right?" "You've lost me." "See, there have always been people of fairy visiting the mortal world. Well, until recently. The Clover effect has cut back on that." He frowned. "And until just lately, there have always been mortals who have crossed over into fairy. So most of the difference between what some mortals call us and what some others call us is just the difference in mortal languages. You call us fairies. Other mortals call us Perries, or whatever the Chinese word or the Balinese word is. See? But there is another difference too. It was a Ferrisher who did the important work on it, actually." He nodded slowly. "Holdfast Buckram, a few centuries back, wrote a marvelous book called The Mortal Lens, about how mortals tend to see what they want to see. No offense." He belched. "Excuse me." Theo was trying to pay attention. This was something he hadn't read about in his great-uncle's story. But a fairy lordling at one of the other tables in the quiet room was smoking what looked very much like a cigarette in a long cigarette holder, and Theo found himself wishing he had the courage to go bum one. But that would be asking for trouble, wouldn't it? He tried to refocus on Cumber Sedge. "So I see most of these fairies as looking like the kind of fairies I expect to see?" "More or less." Sedge got the attention of their waitress and ordered another round of drinks. Theo shook his head. He had been drinking only a sweet wine and was only on his second glass since reaching the club, but he was already feeling more fuzzy than he wanted to. So, if you had grown up in some quite different bugger, tradition, you'd be seeing and hearing things a bit differently. Theo had now stopped listening entirely. The young, pale-haired fairy with the cigarette holder had leaned back to laugh at something. Sitting on his far side was Poppy Thornapple. "Oh, my sweet Jesus," said Theo. "That only a little," Cumber announced cheerfully. "Vilmos, I told you, don't do that," said Applecore. "There, over at that table. It's the girl we were on the train with." Poppy was dressed quite differently now, no longer wearing what he realized had been her meeting her family clothing. In a sort of elaborate morning outfit with a surprisingly low bodice and makeup that looked like it belonged in a Japanese play, she blended in well with her companions, but he knew, without doubt, it was her. He was just surprised by the flip-flop in his stomach. Remorse? Or just jealousy? She was leaning her head against the young lord with the cigarette. "Well, I'm not surprised," Applecore said. "This is just her sort of place, isn't it?" Before Theo could reply, Poppy looked up and saw him. She had been speaking, and for a moment she simply froze, mouth open, eyes suddenly wide and startled. Then she looked away and finished what she had been saying, forcing a laugh. When her companions responded and the conversation eddied away, she looked at him again. This time it was as though a gate had been slammed down behind her eyes. She stared at him as though she had never seen him before and never wished to see him again. After a moment, she whispered something to the pale-haired fairy and got up and left the room, her stiff, wide skirt swinging. "Just a minute," Theo told Applecore. "I'll be right back." "Don't you dare, Vilmos," the sprite began, but he was already up from the table and heading for the door. She wasn't on the stairs. He went down into the full blare of the music and pushed alongside the pulsing swarm of dancers, looking for her on the floor or in one of the alcoves that lined the wall, dark places where people were kissing and groping, inhaling things out of odd little crystalline tubes, or engaging in other activities he couldn't quite make out, but about which he felt he could make a good guess or two. He found her at the bar, waiting for a drink. "Hello," was the only thing he could think of to say. "Do I know you?" For a moment he wondered if he had mistaken a mere resemblance under thick makeup, but then he remembered the way she had looked at him across the tables, the anger and hurt. "You know me, Poppy, from the train." "I don't think so. I certainly never talked to country riffraff on trains, so you must be mistaken, very badly mistaken." She would not meet his eye. "Look, I'm sorry it turned out that way. I didn't want to leave, but we had to." Still looking toward the bartender, mixing her drink, she said, "I'd hate to have to call for security. They're extremely rough here in Hellebore House, as you might guess. They would probably break your legs at the very least. And the wings that you are no doubt hiding under that ill-fitting jacket, well, they would probably rip them right off. All right, I'll leave you alone." It had been stupid coming after her. What had changed? And he could only hope she was exaggerating for effect and that she wouldn't really call security. The last thing he needed was for that to happen. I just wanted you to know that I was sorry and that I didn't lie to you about anything. It was just bad timing." He turned and walked away. "Stop! Come here." He turned and looked at her, wondering if she had changed her mind, and wanted to keep him in sight until she could call for the bouncers. She had an odd look in her eyes, a staring, red-rimmed intensity. "I just want you to know," she said quietly, making him lean forward to hear until his face almost touched hers, That. I hate you, Theodorus Weft Daisy, or whoever you really are. Do you understand? I'll be staying at Thornapple House for another week before I go back to school, and you are not under any circumstances to call me there on my private line, because I hate you, you wretched, horrible, heartless monster. She abruptly reached up and pulled his head down toward hers, then kissed him so hard that her teeth banged against his. When she let go, he tasted blood from his own lip. She was crying. Now go away, she said. You spoiled my evening. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve, smearing her makeup, then turned to shout at the bartender, Running water and black iron, where is my drink? Theo stumbled back across the club, a bit overwhelmed. Someone grabbed his arm near the bottom of the stairs. It took him a moment to recognize Cyrus Jonquil. The young fairy lord was even more happily drunk than before, his hair disarranged and his shirt unbuttoned to reveal ivory skin almost to the navel. He looked quite wild and beautiful. There was something deeply, weirdly attractive about him that had nothing to do with sex. At least Theo hoped it had nothing to do with sex. Daisy, there you are. Where have old Cumberbumber and the Fingerling girl got to? Upstairs. Well, you're missing the most tremendous fun. One of the Campion lads was teasing the Hellebore security, who didn't take it well. They just took Campion out on a stretcher, but he was still ragging them even as they put him in the hospital coach. Hysterical. Theo was distracted by the sound of someone shouting at the top of the stairs. Shouting very loud, he realized, if he could hear it over the thump and whine of the music. As he reached the door, something flew into his face like a confused bird, battering him for a moment in a flurry of wings and tiny limbs. There you are, Applecore said as she fluttered backward. Oh, and you too, your lordship. I was just coming to look for you. It's your friend, Sedge. But Theo, for one, did not have to be told that. Cumber Sedge, who had apparently had a bit more to drink than was absolutely optimum, was standing on the tabletop shouting at the gathering of fairy lordlings of which Poppy had been part. Theo was grateful to see that there was no sign of her now. It was bad enough trying to figure out what was going on between the two of them without adding a shit-faced Farisher into the mix. And just because you're born to the right families, you think you're better than everyone. Cumber swayed and pointed a wavering finger at the fairies. Do you think everyone wants to be like you? Poppy's companion, the young fairy with the cigarette holder, saw Cyrus and called out, Ah, there you are, Jonquil. Is this one of yours? If he is, you'd better silence him before someone takes off fence and has his head. Point taken, Foxy, said Cyrus. Maybe we'll just trundle him home. But Cumber Sedge would not be so easily muffled. I don't belong to anyone, he screamed. You wingless bastards run everything, but you don't own me. Everyone in the room was watching now, and Theo saw someone on the stairs below him turn and head back down toward the ground floor, perhaps looking for the massive security guards. If Cumber went to jail, Theo had a feeling he might wind up there as well. For a moment he considered making a run for it. What did he really owe the little Farisher anyway? But the thought of wandering the alien street showed that for the foolishness it was. He was relieved when Applecore settled on his shoulder again. We have to get him out of here, he said. Oh, we have to get him out of here, he said. Now, you have a gift for the obvious, boyo? Poppy Thornapple's former companion was actually debating with Cumber, debating or playing with him as a cat with a mouse. Wingless, the young fairy said with a lazy grin. And did you not choose to be the same? If you are so fond of wings, little class warrior, where are yours? Cumber Sedge gave out a drunken shriek of frustration. He crouched down, and for a horrifying moment Theo was positive he was about to leap onto his tormentor. Theo and Cyrus both sprang toward the Farrisher, but he was only setting his drink down on the table. An instant later, he straightened up and yanked his shirt over his head. Somehow, he managed to keep upright long enough for Theo and Cyrus to reach his side and take his arms. But Cumber fought with surprising strength, and though Jonquil hung on, Theo could not. Cumber Sedge turned halfway around toward the table of young fairy nobility to show them the pair of jagged pink scars on his back. "Where are my wings?" he shrieked. "Gone? Cut off? Because my mother want me to be like you. But I wish I had them still. Do you hear me? Because a fairy without wings is nothing. A flightless abomination." Cyrus tugged the Farrisher roughly off the table and wrapped his shirt back around him before shoving him toward the door. Theo followed closely, Applecore hunched down and riding his shoulder like a jockey. The jonquil heir stopped in the doorway and bowed to the crowd, most of whom seemed more amused than anything else. "Well," Cyrus shouted above the music, "another exciting evening at Christmas, eh? But I think we'll get this little fellow home now. Someday all their houses will burn down," Cumber Sedge murmured, "and I'll be one of the ones cheering." Only Theo heard him. In the elevator down, Cyrus was still cheerful. "Hidden depths, eh, Sedge?" "None of you ever liked me," Cumber said quietly. "The whole time we were in school together, you ignored me. You didn't even bother to pretend." For a moment, Cyrus Jonquil's face revealed something startlingly cool and hard. "Oh, stop blubbering, Sedge. What did you expect? You're only a Farrisher after all." And, okay, we can start the next chapter. We've got time. Chapter 21. I just saw that comment, Angie. Not out of practice. I don't do that anymore, really. Hardly ever. Have an occasional drink with friends or my wife when we're out to dinner or something. But where am I? 21. In Thornapple House. I don't know how far we'll get into this one since it's getting close to 8 o'clock my time. The big coach slid past the gates and down the long driveway lined with poplars. The lower part of the tower stood mostly dark, as was to be expected. It was halfway between midnight and dawn, after all, and even the most powerful families had to be seen conserving energy. But there was a cluster of lit windows on one of the top floors. "Father, up working late," she thought. As she stepped from the car, she could just hear the quiet moaning of the tree nymphs in their restless sleep. The spells on them were powerful, but even so they could not be entirely silenced. "They're mourning all the other trees gone here in the middle of the city, all their kin killed or dispossessed," one of her childhood nurses had told her. "A terrible thing that was done here, terrible." That nurse had not lasted long, but her words had stayed with Poppy. In the small hours, there was no traffic to hide the nymph's lament, and it left her shivering. Melander Foxglove slid out behind her, pulled her back toward him. He twined his long arms around her and searched for her lips. His mouth smelled of myrtle pastilles, which he sucked to cover the faintly corrupt scent of pixie dust. "Shall I come in, fair Poppaea? Shall we have a little Mabon Eve drink?" "I'm tired, Lander." He raised an eyebrow, then leaned back against the side of the huge coach. "You've been strange all night, Pops. Not your normal entertaining self at all." He rubbed up a bit of elemental fire between his fingertips and lit his cigarette in its long holder, then blew a twining snake of smoke. "I hope this won't be an all-the-time thing, little one. That would get boring." She hated it when he called her little one. It was the kind of name her father used on those long ago and extremely rare occasions when he had tried to be affectionate, the kind of non-specific endearment that Poppy suspected allowed Lord Thornapple not to remember which of his 7 daughters he was talking to. And it also reminded her of something else she would rather have forgotten, namely that she was half a head shorter than any of her friends. She stiffened in his arms. "I'm sorry to offend you, Master Foxglove." His eyebrow lifted again at her tone. "Black iron, what crawled into you and died?" He let go of her and stretched lazily. "That's my ancient father's bodyguard, Gummy, waiting there at the door, so the old fellow must be here discussing affairs of the realm with your daddums. Surely you don't mind if I come in and see whether he wants to catch a ride home with me. Your father must have his own coach. Not if he came with Lord Hellebore, which he probably did. The three of them are as close as the unseelie host these days." He sniffed. "They seem to think that if they stopped interfering with everything, the whole place would turn back into the wildwood again. I told you, Melandra, I'm tired. No one wants to get under your petticoats that badly, Pops, least of all me. There are a million fish in Is, so don't be so full of yourself. All I'm doing is coming in to see if my father wants a ride home." "You hate your father." "Yes, but only to keep things interesting." She shrugged, too tired to argue, but the idea of having to talk to anyone, let alone having to fight that person off, made her feel almost ill. She was growing weary of Melander Foxglove. In fact, the entire night had been a mistake. After the terrible funeral for her brother, the oppressive stillness of the grove, the weight of tradition around her like a thick fog, then the relatives and friends at the wake talking about Orion Thornapple as though he had been some kind of young rose instead of what he was, a rotten little shit. She had thought it would do her good to go out with her friends somewhere loud and dark. But the fact was, she had to admit she didn't really like most of her friends. And seeing Theo hadn't helped. She had all but begged him to call her. What kind of way was that for a young woman of her class and connections to behave? He was probably laughing at her right now with his low-life friends, especially that snippy little sprite. Melander gave the large gray person a mock salute. "What's the good word, Gummy?" "Overtime," grunted the bodyguard. Poppy dropped her black spiderweb cloak behind the front door. It was worth thousands, but she half hoped someone would steal it, or at least step on it, so she'd have an excuse to go out shopping to get another. She didn't want to be home. She hated this place. Then again, she didn't particularly want to be back at school either. "By the way, who was that fellow you were talking with downstairs at the bar?" young Foxglove asked suddenly. "A bit heavy-set, strange haircut. I didn't recognize him. What were you doing? Spying on me?" He blew a smoke ring. "I was on my way to the gents, as it happens. My, we are self-absorbed tonight, aren't we? And a little tense. Why, is he some new flame of yours?" The question, and the hopelessness she felt even trying to answer that question in her own mind, still hung over her like the smoke ring when the lights in the hallway suddenly flickered once, then went out. "Another cursed blackout." Melander Foxglove's sharp features flicked up like a red ghost as he drew on his cigarette. "You can't get those bloody-minded power plant workers to do a decent day's work. They need culling. There hasn't been a real crackdown in years." He curled an arm around Poppy. "Don't worry, I'll make a little light." As fire sputtered silently between his fingers, she ducked out of his grasp. "I don't need your help, thank you." "You're being very strange tonight, Pops. Come on, give me a kiss and let's make up." For a moment she hesitated. She didn't know what she wanted, not really, and it would be nice to be held. Lander wasn't the worst boy in the world, even though he was irritating her a bit just now. But as he moved toward her, finger and thumb curled, elemental fire dancing between them, she saw something repellently acquisitive in his face, as though the foxfire revealed something that had been hidden. He was his father, or would be very soon. In fact, he was her own father, or as near as made no difference. Just another in the legion of privileged lordlings, who passed the world back and forth between them as though it were an object of little interest, and handled the lives of their women and servants with the same blithe unconcern. The Queen wouldn't put up with it. That was a startling thought, because it was so unexpected. All those lessons learned in childhood that she'd thought she'd long since forgotten, all those famous old stories that she and the other girls used to ridicule after Young Blossom's meetings, they hadn't gone away at all. And whether they were true stories or not, what did it matter, really? The ideas were right. When the king made the Queen angry, she didn't just bow her head and take it. She left him whenever the mood struck her. She took lovers, showed him up for a fool. She was Titania the Glorious, and if they irritated her, she would have burned up my father and Foxglove and all this lot like sawdust. "Leave me alone, Melander," she said, and turned and walked across the dark entry hall. But he would not leave her alone. She heard his footsteps behind her. "Ah, so we want to be chased, do we?" She could call the guards. One word, even one strong thought, and the hob would have half a dozen brawny creatures down on him in seconds. She wasn't some servant girl to be trifled with, even if he was the son of one of the leading families. She was a thorn apple. Her father was first counselor. But if he didn't go quietly, if there was some ruckus or a public scene, Daddy would be so tiresome about it. She reached deep into her memory for a charm. It was something she hadn't used in years, since the days of sneaking out of the residence hall with Calpurnia and Julia, the Woodbine sisters, and coming back late to find Miss Stonecrop waiting for them, old Stony, so angry her spectacles were heat-fogged. Poppy whispered the words of the charm under her breath, felt for the thought in the way her tutors had showed her. It was a wriggling thing, small, shiny, and hard to grasp as a fish in muddy water. And she caught it. "Poppy! Iron and blood, where did you go? Poppy!" Suppressing a giggle, which would give her away to Melander Foxglove's sharp senses, no matter what the charm did, she turned and went right past his outstretched hand, retaining the memory of his stunned, irritated face in the glow of the elemental light to enjoy later. He was sharp, though. He felt the faint breeze of her passage and lunged at her, but missed. She hurried toward the stairwell. She would take an elevator from the next floor up. And that's where we're going to stop for this evening. I had mentioned, I think, online somewhere that I might go longer tonight, but I'm still a little bit hors de combat, as we say in French, and which basically means a little bit under the weather, unable to fight, I think is what it literally means, or outside the fight. Anyway, or before anyway, doesn't matter. I can't think well anyway. My brain is fuzz. But what I probably will try to do, what day of the week is, hang on, I'm still here. I'm looking at my calendar. Let's see if it comes up. Okay, so the first is Friday. So we will have a couple of days into the new year. Maybe we'll have a more like a New Year's party and trying to kick 2020 in the rump and send it out the door. I will think about it and see what I've got in the way of resources. But the one thing I definitely will do is I will be back for my next Sunday reading, both the early in the morning one and the now one in this time slot. And I will also say thank you very much to you all for joining me. It's always a great pleasure to have you and to have people to read to and hang out with. And as I always try to remind everybody, be good to yourselves. Be good and kind to yourselves and those around you and everybody that you can help in the middle of this wretched, now ending but not actually finished yet 2020. And we will all continue to help each other out, and we will get through, and things will be better, and you can take that to the bank. Whichever bank you want, I don't care. Credit union, local check cashing service, doesn't matter. I'm just being dramatic. I always like to point my finger at things because that makes it very personal. Anyway, so once again, thank you so much for being with me. Love to all of you guys from the Beale Williams Rancho Diverso here in California, and I hope you will have a good night, and I will see you very soon. Okay.